Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before I begin, I just wanted to point out that there is a show in our grad gallery that will be open until 8. So after the talk, please feel free to check out the show. It is my pleasure to introduce the DMA 2018-2019 Arts Council Professor, Gelare Khoshgozaran. Through video, performance, installation, and writing, Gelare's work explores displacement, intimacy, memory, and the inextricable nature of the personal and the political. Her work, whether video, installation, or writing, is always potent, powerful, and moving. Her essays and interviews on art, politics, and culture have been published in Contemporary, The Brooklyn Rail, Parquet, Extra, Ajam Media Collective, and Temporary Art Review, among others. And her work has been shown at LACE, Human Resources, the New Museum, the Queens Museum, LAXART, and recently in the Hammer Museum as part of Made in LA. It is my pleasure to welcome Gelare. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's so nice to be here giving this talk with so many familiar, lovely faces in the room. I'm going to go over a while back, so I'm going to start with 2009 when I went to grad school at USC, which sounds like a different era because it was a different school. So this is a picture of my studio wall at USC, and I had a lot of just empty white walls to deal with at the time. So lots of staring at a wall and seeing different things in it. And then at some point turning around and looking at other things to make work. So this was one of the first video work that I made. I come from a background in very traditional skill-based training in photography. And when I came here to go to grad school, mainly because of financial reasons, I could not afford to make photos. And you know, there was a lot of frustration on the side of the professors coming into the studio and looking at my computer screen to talk about photographs. So I turned to video, and I started looking at things that I hadn't worked with before. YouTube was a big thing for me at the time because, you know, I was introduced to this. I had limited access to YouTube, I want to say, and sort of difficult, you know, to that point, working on a Wi-Fi internet connection and having to use proxy. So when I came here and I was looking at YouTube as this really random archive or non-archive of things that I hadn't looked at or thought of in over 10, 15 years. So this was a video that I made out of, I found this original excerpt and the broadcast version of this BBC series called The Secret Army. So I found both excerpts, the one that was on TV and I grew up on, and the original version, the British version. And there's this scene of the kissing that's taken out of that version that I watched as a kid. And then I kind of synced them up together and then let one lag behind the other. And this kind of lagging became a thing that I kept going back to in different projects and in different ways. And then the other place that I spent a lot of my time was just Uvu. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was the cheap version of Skype, and I had this really cheap, crappy PC that Skype was not quite, you know, conducive to, and I had to use, and especially if you Skype back home, on lower speed internet, Uvu was a lot more manageable because it could accommodate all the pixelated sort of imagery that you could get without dropping the call. So this was, and this was hours and hours when I was talking to friends who had left around the same time and were living in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. And my best friend at the time was living in New York. You know, this was like 6, 7 hours a day, and she would be in the studio, I would be at home, or like I would be in my kitchen, and she would be in her living room getting a haircut or falling asleep, or, you know, all of that was on Uvu because that was basically my life. For a while, and I didn't have a car in LA or any friends, or, you know, it's just hard to socialize. So this is a video that we did, and when she came to LA, we made this video of us watching this dance routine on YouTube on our individual computers with their backs to each other, and We were watching this video by this guy who's like the David Simon of Iran. We were watching, and it was actually produced in LA. So we were watching the video and imitating the dance routines on Uvu, and then at some point we switched places and you realize that we're in the same room. And it's just this, one is my PC and one is her MacBook at the time. Hence the difference in color balance. And then also, this was a really politically tense time. A lot of my friends had fled, or they were kind of in hiding, and I didn't really know where they were in the world. So at some point, my friend and I, we just decided to have this video call, and he was in Sweden at the time. And we decided to, instead of talking out of this fear of surveillance from both states that we were dealing with, we would communicate on Uvu without talking, and we would just write our sentences with a pen and paper and share the text as a visual element with each other. So this was like 10, 12 minutes of a conversation, and we exchanged maybe 5 sentences because of all the glitches and legibility, and like, is it at the right distance, is it not? And then there was also a layer of encryption in that it was not English or Farsi, it was transliterated, and it was somewhere in between. So it was both English, Farsi, and Farsi transliterated in English. And that's when he broke the news of one of our friends, having fled and being in Istanbul and all of that. And then besides this familiar realm of the internet connecting me to my friends, serendipitously, I turned to chat roulette. The reasons for that is a lot. This is 2009, 10. The reasons for that are many, and I'm not going to get into that. But I was thinking about this idea of the anonymity and the voyeuristic look or whatever. And as you can imagine, there was like one after another, after another, and after another. These guys just jerking off to who knows who. And then there were surprises like this one, and then at some point, I started doing this durational performance where I would just sit on chat roulette blindfolded, and I would not get any sort of response for the most part. And then at some point started, showing up with the text written on my body, and this is around the re-election of Obama, and like Republicans are saying that he's going to attack Iran and to get reelected, and this is the new wave of sanctions, and it's really tense politically. So I just went on chat roulette and wrote "Bomb Iran" on my chest, and just sat there for hours and documented the reactions. Of course, lots of jerk-offs, and like this guy finally got interested in trying to read what's on my chest. And like he goes back and forth 20 times almost. And I had no idea any of this was going on until I saw the footage, obviously. And then later on, this is a little bit later, and I had my Bosnian Otter kind of response, and I was in a really difficult, precarious situation in terms of immigration and visa, financially, emotionally, all of those. And I had my version of, I'm too sad to tell you. And then I'm gonna skip quite a few years to 2016. So one of the things that I'm still pretty preoccupied with as an artist is this idea of an art project, an anti-war art project. What's an art project, or what could be a practice of writing and image making that's explicitly anti-war, and how could that? And there's always the tricky question of representation. So how do you talk about war without showing war? So these photos are 1982, 86, and 88. So 3 instances that the UN General Assembly unanimously voted for the end of the Iran-Iraq War, which was one of the deadliest traditional war of the 20th century, of course, besides the world wars. It lasted 8 years, 500,000 people were dead, and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in casualties in both sides. So I turned to a lot of different things, and like as always, I didn't know how to arrive at what I wanted to do, and I knew that I need to approach it from multiple directions, from looking at UN archives to personal memories and relying back on narratives from my community, my people, my friends, and my family. So I began to think about the newspaper as this, as the most widespread medium during a time of war, in heightened propaganda and ideas of nationalism, but at the same time, images of gore and decapitation and destruction and bombs and whatever. So I got curious to look at the newspaper, but at the same time, I knew that those were not the sort of images that I wanted to deal with or think through when I think about the war, and also thinking about the sort of abstractions that would happen in a gathering like this, where a bunch of people would get together and vote for the end of something that's going on for 8 years and is affecting people in really different material and tangible ways. So abstraction was something that, for me, was like not just a relief, but a necessity at the time, because I also thought about this idea of leisure, and like if you live under a dire circumstance like war, it's a totally different relationship than looking at it in retrospect or from a distance, because eventually you're living your life, and living in that life, you also reproduce, you have kids, you raise them, you celebrate birthdays, and you think about leisure. And in thinking about leisure, I thought about the crossword puzzles in the time of war on a newspaper, and this idea of literally picking up an activity that helps your brain think a different way, or like play a certain game of memory or question solving or riddles, as opposed to the didactic content of a newspaper that tells you what's on the news and what are the reports of casualties and death. So I kind of approach this from this conspiracy theory point of view, which is very common also in my work, thinking about, what were they trying to subliminally tell people in those crossword puzzles? And then that sort of became so secondary when I started looking at these black and white grids as these spaces of respite or projection. So I worked with my mom to try to get a hold of the archives of this newspaper whose name would translate to Cosmos. And we were able to collect hard copies of the same paper from the 9 months. And also, again, like thinking about this like liminal space of being in the world but not having a consciousness. I was thinking about my mom's pregnancy and like the fact that people actually had sex during the war. That's really mind-blowing to me. They did. Lots of it. And so I thought about the 9 months that my mom was pregnant with me, and this, the idea of the newspaper getting published every day of those 9 months, that I was not really in the world, but I was part of it. So I extracted the puzzles, and I put them in chronologically from right to left, because that's how we read, and for 3 months of summer, well, I was born, yeah, so it would be summer, fall, and winter. And the pieces that are missing are just days that either the newspaper was not published because it was a holiday, or it was missing from the archive. So it gave this sort of hologram, or whatever you can think of it, to be read by whatever machine and be interpreted by something, I don't even know. But the abstraction was really necessary for me, because recently I've been also thinking about interruptions and abstraction as just a way of, because we're so bombarded by information and so bombarded by representation, and in art so much didacticism, that I feel like I really personally need these spaces where there's just, you can trip on the black and white squares of something instead of really getting direct information about it. And maybe this is a little more effective, even if we're thinking about change or like a visceral reaction or taking action. I've been thinking about the static noise on TV also, like this mandatory interruption of a programming, and just sitting in front of it and listening to white noise and looking at that as opposed to content or news as a way of getting information or knowledge. And then the X's that are on the sides are also probably early abstract forms that I was exposed to, again, in the context of war, because that's how you protected the windows from shattering when there was jets flying overhead and the sound wall would break. And you can probably see them areas of the US that are susceptible to hurricanes, and just to protect glass from shattering in the face of natural disasters or war. So the piece was, it was legible from both sides, and it was only when you went around it and saw the backs of the paper that you could tell that this is taken from most likely a newspaper of war. You could see like heads of the people and some text if you could read, and all kinds of other images that you could probably make connections from where the newspaper was taken from. And there was a 2-channel video, so the channel 1 was the rest of the paper that I shot in a certain way, and this one was a live stream of the UN webcast, and at the time they were talking, it was the peak of, I wouldn't say the peak of the crisis, but the peak of the media coverage of the crisis in Syria. So that was the sound in the space, whatever was happening at the UN headquarters. You would enter the gallery and you would hear them as you would watch this action on the screen. These are just stills from the video. And I animated some of the words that became temporarily legible through this movement of this overwhelming archive, and I translated them to English. I'm not gonna dwell much on this, but this was also part of the space, and this was the other piece that was in this space, because that's how I had access to all the pieces that I needed to, from the documents to personal archives to the newspapers or whatever I needed to revisit to make this project. These were shipped to me by my mom, and these are just LED lit packages that I had received at that point, over the 3 or 4 years that I was researching and thinking about this project. And the newspapers came in this fat one. And of course, this piece is called U.S. Customs Demands to Know, and it's an ongoing piece. I've been doing it again since 2013, and they randomly get opened and searched because, and the title is taken from this, I don't even want to say a protocol or a memorandum that since 9/11, any package can be opened and searched without a warrant, especially if it comes from Iran. So the temporality of receiving these packages, and also the serendipitous juxtaposition of objects that I had requested, and also the ones that my mom, at her discretion, thought that she could put in the packages, are also part of this experience, at least for me, and I know that not all of that is put out there as part of the work. But again, like the space that I had created in the gallery and the darkness, and I was really thinking about, when I think about war, what do I remember, and also, how is that different from how war is represented in the media? And of course, the violence is a major part of it, and there's no way in denying that. But my memories had a lot to do with being in a dark space and being a kid and seeing explosions outside, or like this burst of light, or being in this space with your parents where everyone's pretending that this is a hide and seek game, but everybody from the 3-year-old me to the 10-year-old brother to my parents knew that this is a matter of life and death. And how to bring that into a space without really trying to, and I think that's why it's important for me personally to really rely on personal experience, not as the end of any project, but as the beginning and as a way to think about alternative ways of image making and space making that does not fall into the same sort of cliche ideas of what a thing looks like. Let me check time. Okay, I'm doing pretty well. I'm gonna get into the oil. So these are some early photos of, this is a different project. I'm talking 2018 right now. That was 2016. This is a different project where, these are just archival early photographs of oil discovery in the southwest of Iran, in Masjid Suleiman, which was the first place in Iran where oil was discovered, and then a lot happened after that. And this is one of the photos, one of the first Pan-American oil stations in the Persian Gulf. These are just some archival photos that I found through different resources. And then these are some and I often research things both in English and Farsi. I look at different resources and I try to, and it's fascinating how different and how convergent they are at times. these are some photos that show, you know, this presence of the foreigners, basically, in land in search of this mysterious substance that bubbles out of, you know, from under the earth. And also thinking about this presence of this, you know, tower-like architecture in the desert is pretty significant when you think about the oil industry. And my relationship to oil is complicated, as you would imagine. But I was interested in, and then, you know, and of course, you know, this happened over the years. It was not an immediate sort of success because they were looking for oil, and there were different teams from different countries that would spend, you know, decades or years at a time, and, you know, with different degrees of success and failure. And I don't know if anyone has seen Bertolucci's disastrous La Via del Petrolio, which was one of the only documentary, one of the first films that he, I would say TV series, 3 episodic kind of documentary that he made, and no wonder why he didn't continue making documentaries. It's like, it's a classical sort of Orientalist way of just arriving somewhere and then documenting something and then taking it back. So he basically followed the route of oil, spending some time in the Gulf, in Iran, and then going back to Italy and kind of documenting, following the path of oil, basically. It's fascinating. So I wanted to, again, like this fascination with abstraction, and abstraction as a way to think about politics and to think about economy, which is not something that I invented, but, you know, something that I'm definitely interested in. I wanted to kind of rebuild my relationship with oil in a newly intimate way that's more than just following the oil barrel price or, you know, other sorts of engagements or just following the news. Especially because I grew up with oil as a household staple, because that's how you ran a stove or, you know, a heater, especially when there's war, you know, you go to the basic immediate ways of keeping your house warm and cooking and all of that. So the smell of oil is very sort of homey to me in the weirdest way. But having been here, you know, besides driving through Central California or, you know, like San Pedro or other location where there's extensive oil or like the La Brea pits. Besides that, I feel like the relationship to oil is always so mediated and so abstracted that I wanted to have another experience with it. So I looked online and I found this place in Texas, no surprise, where they would sell you oil and you could just order it online and then they would be shipped to your studio as it was. UPS guy knocks on the door and brings 2 gallons of oil to my studio. I had no idea it was so easy. And, you know, opening this can of worms literally, you know, was a life-changing experience because it was literally out of the well and into the studio. And it was this really unsettling experience of being impossible to live with the substance because it's so bio and it's so toxic at the same time that you can't, you know, like it's fuming in the hot studio in the sun and in the summer, and it was impossible to tame and to sit with it as a substance in the space. What happened in that time period is a different story, but in the end I ended up making a video, and through the video that I was making, you know, something kind of haphazard happened, and this out of the stain formed this kind of monster-looking creature, and it started growing, and that became sort of the piece itself. And I'll show a little bit of an excerpt, probably like 2-3 minutes. But I was, you know, going back to these archival photos, what was really interesting to me was that there's really, you know, from Negarestani saying oil is the lubricant of the war on terror and all kinds of like speculative realism, realistic sort of ways of talking about oil, which are fascinating nonetheless, and also to the Bertolucci. I was more interested in thinking about this really weird presence from the point of view of the locals. And of course, I don't have access to that, and you know, it's not that my ancestors are these people in these photos in any way, but I was searching for a voice that would narrate this presence. And literally, you know, the first time that like blue-eyed people are in the desert and they're coming with their towers and they're digging into the earth to bring something out that is supposedly expensive, but you don't really know why that is. And also most of the nomads living in these areas are living on a economy, you know, like a barter and exchange economy, and currency is not even a thing, or like wage labor is not a thing. And oil culture really changed a lot of that and brought and introduced a lot of like newly capitalistic sort of ideas of thinking about labor and work to the area, like to the extent that they couldn't even convince the workers to stick around and work, because of course they were cheap laborers as opposed to, you know, the British team bringing their own people to the region. But they didn't really know what they should do with the money, so they would stick around for a day or two, get the money, go back, and never come back. So that's when they started paying them on a weekly basis and then on like bi-weekly basis and all of that. So it really changed the culture in really colonial capitalistic ways, and I was more interested in that, and especially during the time that, you know, we're going through a famine and there's literally people living in villages with barely access to any food or clean water, and what did they think of this weird thing, phallic thing going up in the desert and going down into the earth. So I turned to literature, and I found this book by one of my favorite Iranian writers, and he writes short stories, folklore stories, and fairy tales. And he, you know, one of the stories became sort of the inspiration for the way that I set up this show, which was, the story is, you know, in a nutshell, there's villagers that are going through the famine, and it's very common for them to go and loot the other village to take food. And at the same time, one of them, when he's walking back from home, from work to home, or like looking for food and coming back home, he finds this strange object on the road, and he doesn't really know what it is. But then in this strange object, he calls his comrades to come and take a look and see what it is, and you know, they start projecting their own ideas on what this is, and then at the end they decide that it's a shrine. So they drag the thing back to the village and they set up a shrine, hoping that it will cure all the ill, and it will bring money and prosperity to the village. And long story short, there's American military presence in the region, and they come looking for this lost object, and they destroy the walls and they take the shrine out, and then the story ends with the sentence that the villagers were kept weeping. So I thought about that story as sort of maybe the way that I want to think about this like presence of the oil in this exhibition that I'm doing. So this is one of the automated, this is an automated viewfinder with some of the archival photos that I shared, and this is an automated flip book of oil rigging in Central California, because I'm also interested in, you know, a lot of the things that I do have to do with me or Iran, but that doesn't, it's not because I'm from Iran necessarily, or like any sort of projection like that. It's more like there's complicated relationships between all of these things that I'm thinking about, and California is weird enough to always bring me back to it, and I wanted to make those connections through this project. So I kind of like spatially thought of it as this, you know, like this like 3D, or like a bent screen, and this like idea of like what's behind this thing, and then there's a sound coming out. And I'm gonna play a short excerpt. The sound is very minimal, but in this space it was supposed to be felt more physically than anything. Oh, just decided to go to the next one. And then I'm going to jump to a different project that was made slightly before that. So this is 2018 still. This is a photo, and at some point from video, I kind of found my way back to analog, but through film and 16 millimeter. This is a photo from the southern parts of Iran again, which is an area contested through history from different points of view. They never had a chill, really, because of their proximity to oil, to the Gulf, and all kinds of borders. So this is a photo from the 80s, from the time of the war, and this is an area where palm trees have been either burned or cut, or have been kind of, this area has been destroyed because of something that had to do with the war. And this is sort of, for me, it's a very typical way of thinking, again, like thinking about representation. Like when I think about war, I think palm tree. And I know that that's not very convenient to live in LA and like drive through Beverly Hills and like, ooh, leisure. But especially particularly like the headless palm is so iconic of the war for me and of violence on humans and then the environment alike. This is a screen grab from the Google Street View of, again, the area that's called the Shatt al-Arab, which is the part around near the Iran-Iraq border where initially the reason why the war started in 1980. This is a still from my film in California, and the location here is Thermal, California, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but like having been there for the first time, it was really schizophrenic for me, thinking about like landscape and like psychological landscape, and thinking about where I am and where is this land and what is happening around me. And then, I got more curious on these names of why is this town in the middle of California called Mecca? That cannot be, just a coincidence. Like there's got to be a history to this. Or like if you've been to Coachella, you've probably turned on the Boulevard of Arabia at some point in Indio. And these were things that were kind of in the back of my mind, but I never really dug through or wonder why, or like got any sort of historical evidence as to why they happened until I did. And that was through a sociologist that I learned about through another artist and her artist book that was published. And I realized that, a lot of these names and a lot of this history in California goes back to the introduction of dates to this state and the date industry. So legend has it that in the dates were introduced to California in, there's a debate, but some sources 1902, some say 1904, which was the first time. And, what would be the word for an agriculture expert? Anyway, experts would travel to the region and bring back cultivars to California, and they would test them out here because of the resemblance of the landscape. But then later on, they realized that, it's not very easy to just launch this date campaign and expect for it to pick up. So they had to, because dates were considered really exotic and like, kind of gooey and brown, and they didn't quite sell in California in the way that they had expected them to. So they kind of came up with this idea of doing a sort of product placement based on this idea that the desert in California actually looks like the desert in the Middle East and North Africa. It just looks like Algeria. It just looks like Iraq. It just looks like whatever, anywhere in that area. So they started sort of doing this ritualistic, like they wanted to build these. These are shots from this tiny little catalog that I found through a friend. They wanted to make a Biskra kind of resort in the desert, which never happened. I'm not quite sure why, but they were selling it as, you know, instead of traveling all the way to Algeria, Algeria is right around the corner, just drive 2 hours, and, you know, you don't even have to deal with the people or the language or any of that, or visas, if you will. But it's just around the corner, and they wanted to sell this sort of like getaway, and at the same time promote this product, which was date, and the huge industry that has become these days. So they launched this festival of dates in the 1920s in the Riverside County, and it's pretty intense, but believe it or not, this is still around, and it still continues to this day. Every February you can go to the Riverside County Date Festival, and, you know, you can get all kinds of horrendous situations. So the genie is still there. The bottle, if you will, or whatever this is still there. This is the contemporary genie. This is the historic genie. The only thing that has changed is photography. This building is still there. They call it the what do they call it? They call it the Magic Carpet. There's a Taj Mahal. There's a Taj Mahal Hall of Fame, and there's a Magic Carpet stage where these. I think back in the day it was different, but today the tradition is that. So there were these festivals happening, and then people would get on the stage and do these dances and wear these outfits and all of that. And in the contemporary form, it's really fascinating. This is the same building, and I mean, partly I'm interested in that architecture having been there for more than 100 years, and it's not just like some like containerized replica of something. It's built, it's there, it's still steady. People still like change their outfits before performance there. And in the contemporary sense of it, it's really interesting how it's, you know, obviously there's a lot of veterans living in the area. So at the beginning, you know, there's all these different branches of the military playing their songs, and they honor the veterans, and there's a discount in the entire fare for active duty or veterans of the war. And it's really fascinating too, because, you know, it's majority people of color in this area, and the way that part of the ritual is also not just, you know, it's not just an entertainment thing that happens, but also there's a scholarship that they've been worked with the local high school. So a young girl from the community every year wins the Princess Jasmine Scholarship, and she gets to wear that outfit and walk across the stage and do this. So it's really uncanny, all of this, like what happens in the festival is really fascinating, but also like thinking of it economically is very important, and also it's a tradition that's very dear to the local people of Riverside County, and especially Indio. So I went there, and I looked at this side of the history, like through this research that I found, and then going there and traveling and shooting, and engage, you know, more or less with the people there, or like the people who have been doing this tradition for years. But then this is another photo again from the border in southern Iran. And here's another one. I'm just gonna go through these. Some typical photos of destruction. Oh, these are my drawings from when I was like 3 or 4, I don't know. And even though I was not living near the border, I was not in the south, I was in Tehran, but like this is all you saw on TV, and, you know, boats on a river, and which was probably the Euphrates, which I had never been to, or even, you know, palm trees around, and like the flags. Flags were all over my drawings. Flags, cars, boats, and palm trees, and sometimes helicopters too. So, you know, I was interested, and then the reason why I got introduced to this idea, to this history, this Orientalist history in the desert, was not just arbitrary. It was because little back. I'm going to go back a little bit. So this is Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein. This is during the war with Iran, which the U.S. was backing Iraq at the time, and they knew that they had a chemical weapons program going on, but they kept denying it, and all of those UN meetings the photos that we saw. So the Iranian delegation would show up to those UN meetings and tell them that they're using chemical weapons on the soldiers, and there was denial for 8 years until the war ended. And then we know what happened. So around the time that they invaded Iraq, they started, I read through this, I came across this chapter in a Stephen Graham book, Cities Under Siege, that there were replicas of Middle Eastern cities in the California desert where the military is getting their training in a submersive environment. And that's how, that's how I got introduced to the date palm research, because again, it was no coincidence that there were all these similarities, and the similarities went as far back as agricultural tendency, as far back as agriculture to military. And so I started looking into this, these villages or these training centers, and the most, one of the most famous ones and the biggest ones, which is at Fort Irwin National Training Center, which is 2 hours north of Barstow. So if you drive through the desert and if you go inland for about 3 hours from LA, you will arrive there. And the entire training center is the size of the state of Rhode Island. So it's massive, to say the least. But from what I saw on the news reports and the books, and this chapter in the book was that there's 8 small villages, and Stephen Graham calls them the archipelago of Middle East. Sorry. So I went there, and because they had, not because I had some sort of VIP access, but because they have public tours for the civilians, and they promote them in a way that encourages people to come and see how the army is getting trained in the state of the art and in the subversive environment, so on and so forth. So this is one of the villages that's called, the most famous one is called Medina Wasl, which is the title of my film, and then I'll get into what that name means or may not mean. This is Homeland. I'm not going to get into Homeland, but because it's its own lecture. Homeland is its own fascination. So the title of the city doesn't quite, the Medina Wasl, like my Arabic was good enough to know that there's something off and it doesn't quite make sense. But then, I can demonstrate how it doesn't quite make sense. But I think what they were trying to name it was connecting town or transition town, as this place where the soldiers would go before they would end up in the actual location where the battle was happening. This is another segue, and I'll try to weave it all together. This is, child soldiers was a big thing during the war with Iraq, because Iran had just gone through a revolution, and immediately the war happened, so it was not like they had an amazing army or, lots of money for that development. So there were a lot of volunteer teenage soldiers that would sign up for this cause, and it was the cause of, defending the right against the evil. There was all sorts of rhetorics like that. And child soldiers and prisoners of wars were, a massive kind of crisis during the war that were highly represented also in media and internationally and locally. So this image of the hero, like the 13-year-old adolescent man, was really huge for me as a child. And there were, parts of me that wanted to be them. Ironically, and so and you can see, also looking at this from the point of view of queerness. There's a lot in that, and so for the film, I did a few. The way that I made the film was, the process was that I went to the date palm and I shot my footage. Not the date palm, the date festival, and I shot my footage out of what happened there, and the architecture and whatever I needed from that site. And then I started camping in the desert, wearing this military uniform, which is the kind of the private, what do you call it, like the basic, the private one or whatever, would be the equivalent of these soldiers that would just buy these outfits and then sign up and join the army at the time of the war. So I wanted to embody this teenage soldier one more time, and look at myself in California, and to think about this confusion of landscapes and bodies and places. And by the way, I received this uniform, including the canteen, in one of those lit packages that were not in that photo, but later on. So, you know, that part of the experience of just going around in the desert and camping in this uniform and shooting my footage. And then I thought about also, besides visiting the site, there were a lot of parameters that I had set up for myself as to, again, how to do this without replicating the same sort of fascination of a car bomb, like being blown up, and all the YouTube videos that people have uploaded. And you know, they encourage you to take more footage and put it up. There's very little limitations as to what you can document when you're on the tour. And how it, you know, what it took me to get there and how I passed those military background checks and all of that is a different story. But I was also thinking of, you know, when I thought, I began this film thinking that this is going to be a film essay, and I have all this research and I have all this text, I've written about this, I have all the personal experience and all of that, and I'm just gonna write an essay and shoot the film and put the essay on top, and that would be it. But then I felt like there was something really missing about, you know, like, I don't want to be the narrator of what this is or what this experience is. So I reached out to US, Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, and I just put this weird ad on Craigslist that I want to talk to you about your memories of landscape in the Middle East. And I got, you know, pretty fascinating responses from all sorts of people. So I would just sit with these strangers for an hour, and I would talk them, and I would ask them questions, and I would record their voice. So out of these, and that vantage point was really important to me because it was something that was not, I had not access to. It was not something like a reporter or a person from the area or an outsider. It was like, you are in the position of the invader, but you have diplomatic immunity. You're so bound to the base that you're not even like allowed to go off base, but you're like right next to Euphrates. So like, what is that like, and what did you see? What did you smell? What did the sand look like? What colors did you remember of the landscape? What sounds did you hear in the distance? So we would talk, we would sit down and talk, and I would record those voices. And out of the voices that I recorded, I edited them down. I transcribed them and edited them down. And so the essay in the film came out of these recordings from the people that I interviewed, these total strangers that I sat down with and talked to for hours. And then I hired voice actors to represent each of these voices. And so the narrative kind of is built out of these segments of these people's experiences, and it's overlaid with the footages of mostly the areas in like Mecca and Thermal in California, the palm trees, as well as the military training center. And then in the end, these are just shots from the tour. I'm not gonna get into the details. I know it looks like it could be like a Donald Judd Flavin collaboration. There's very Donald Juddy, all of the bunkers and the minimalist, kind of brutalist light and space. And I'm like freaked out to death here, but it's like, ooh, art. So like the tour itself sort of introduces you to this idea of the Middle East, like they would introduce it to the soldiers too. And of course, you know, at the beginning, you know, they were naive to train the soldiers to think that Afghanistan is the same as Iraq, is the same as Iran, is the same as Pakistan, and like not taking into account, you know, the wide range of landscapes you're dealing with, the wide range of traditions of resistance, the wide range of militia fighting and guerrilla fighting, etc. And then once it became, you know, Iraq's time, they really tried to train the soldiers in submersive environments and teach them about the language and the differences in culture, etc., etc. But again, you know, there's a flattening that happens that I'm really interested in, and like I want to think about that flatness both in the sense that this village is put together as an alleyway in Baghdad, and at the same time, you know, the way that is reflected in U.S. foreign policy, for example, and like I'm not gonna get into that because there's not time, but this kind of confusion of so like they would have these signs. And these are all made of plaster, and they're just not even 3D printed. They're just like handmade fake eggs, and these signs were replicated out of this alley in Iraq So they would teach you what Arabic looks like and how to pronounce this and what it means, and then it tell you what language it is. So that's part of the immersive training we're talking about. And I think for me, entering this project was really interesting, and there was a lot for me to mess with, because I wanted to, instead of kind of like having this attitude of, oh, this is fake, but this is not Iraq, or like, but Iraq also has like Christians, or like Iraq also has like non-Arabic speaking people, like this like idea of like showing an authenticity as an alternative to this like fakeness. I was interested in more confusion, and like, how do I confuse this even further? With my presence, with my memories of the Iran-Iraq war, and then looking back, this is the, what do you call it, Camp Pendleton. This is in San Diego. So this is another site where they have similar sort of replicas of these villages. But the dome is there, the Golden Dome, no matter where you go, from the Date Palm Festival to the Iraqi alleyway to Camp Pendleton, the Golden Dome never leaves you. And this is how it was presented as part of the show. And I'm not going to get into the details of how these decisions were made. And these were, I can say that these were stop motion animations that I had made out of these 4 lengthy documents that NSA, how do you say, declassified after the Iran-Iraq war, that talk about, the case of the chemical weapons and how the U.S. knew that chemical weapons were being used, but they kept denying it. And again, these are part of a history that doesn't necessarily have to do with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but I wanted to bring them all in the same space, and I made this patterned kind of wall out of oil barrel closures, which, was part of also thinking about, like when we think about oil, we think about barrels, but that's not even how it's transferred. It's just pipelines. But like the way that this conjures oil for some people in that space was really interesting to me itself, as this like ornamental element, but also an acoustic wall. So at the end of the film, also like talking about more confusion, so I overlaid, I'm going to show this excerpt, it's like 3-4 minutes, and I'm probably going to end with that. But I used, one of the things about, not being sure that I will even get access to this site was that, I was on a deadline for Made in LA. I had been like chewing on this project for years and years, and there was a deadline, and I'm like, holy shit, I need to have a footage by a certain date, and I'm not even cleared. I don't even know if I'm going to be at the center. So I thought about a plan B, and I was like, maybe I can just map this out on like Google Maps, because I had a panorama, like I had one file that somebody had uploaded from the times that these tours were really hot, and I had downloaded it, and I knew that I could use that and like kind of map it out on, just like overlay these 2 footages and try to map it out virtually. And so the film itself, it goes from the footages and the narratives, and then in the end, it kind of collapses the footages of California with the footages of following the Euphrates and the border between Iran and Iraq, and then it ends with this song that's Iranian, but it's sung in Arabic because the people in the south of Iran speak Arabic, and like again, like trying to further confuse the uses of language and this like flatness of identity that happens when the U.S. military tried to train you on a certain kind of people. So I'm just going to play this excerpt, which is not that long, and then probably end with that. that's it for me.
Anyone have any questions? Here we go. Just have to wait you out.
I wanted to ask about the archival research that you did when you're saying that you were working with both English and Farsi archives. And you said that they had like really different interests.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of like different orientations did they have towards like their materials? Like what different things were they interested in, and that like what different things did they cover that the other one didn't?
I mean, in this one instance, if I want to keep it like focused on this, like the project with the war, for example, there were things that were really obvious if you looked at like the Iranian side of records. For example, the use of chemical weapons that had, you know, taken 20, 25 years to become official records in the West. You know, they had to go through the NSA. Is that the NSA? When am I saying it right? Yeah, they had to go through the NSA archives and then be declassified. And then, you know, for The Guardian to write an op-ed on them 20, 30 years later to become official. Whereas there were pretty known facts when you looked at any newspaper from that time. But also, you know, like from even like the basic algorithmic side of it, even when you search the exact same words in Farsi or in English in Google Images, for example, you get completely different results. And for me, it was important to look at both of these and to play with that and like to have both sides as opposed to just approaching it from one side or the other.
Any more questions?
I'm really interested in your like how you incorporate confusion into your work. I don't know, I think that's oftentimes like overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
What is the importance of confusion for like people outside of the experience or outside of that knowledge?
I think it's tricky to introduce to say. I mean, I even like pedagogically, it's not something that I would even like recommend so confidently, because it can go to hell very easily. Like if you just leave things so loosely open-ended and open to interpretation, you know, it can go anywhere. But I do think of it as a politically important tool to make things less accessible in an intentional way, and in a way that's not flattened in the way that institutional ways of knowledge production have got us so used to. But at the same time, hold on, I wanted to say something and I need to remember that because otherwise this doesn't make any sense at all. So I mean, yeah, I do think of confusion as okay, so this is it. I do think of confusion as a really useful tool of resistance towards conventional ways of perception, right, and interpretation. But I think the way that I use it, and I think the way that, I'm not saying I've been successful, but in the successful examples that I've seen in other artists using it has been in ways that are set with certain parameters that if you are interested and if you look closely, you can trace back the material kind of like almost like in a forensic way. You can trace back the material traces of how things are put. So it's not just randomly, but because of these often contradictory ways that things and spaces and people and languages and signifiers are put into a space, it makes it difficult to just look at it or interpret it from one angle. But at the same time, I think the way that could be done successfully is to think about strict structures and parameters and material ways of why those decisions are made together to be thrown into the same space to create this confusion. And you should be able to unravel that layer by level and get somewhere. Otherwise, I don't know if it's useful, or I don't know if it's if it's meaningful in the ways that I would imagine things to be helpful as a strategy or as a tool. I know that was super vague, but I'm sure I can think about that in more clear ways, and I will tell you afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so hi. So Chandler mentioned in the introduction a little bit about your writing. So I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit about your writing, and also about writing in relation to these other media that you work with. So what is their relationship, and what particular elements can writing contribute to this kind of art practice?
That's a great question, because I had mixed feelings about whether or not bringing up writing today, and I kept it strictly to the art practice. But I use writing mostly, I think, because when a lot of us these days, or like we've been doing for a long time, research-based work. And there's always been this question of where does the artist's research go, and I don't think that it necessarily needs to go in a peer-reviewed, scholarly journal of sociology or something like that, but maybe there are spaces that the writing can be shared. And the way that I think about it is the way that I pair writing with my work is it's often, I think of it as a generous way of providing more context for the work, and also making the work accessible in a different form to people that are geographically probably located in different parts, or like interested in different parts of the work more than the aesthetic decisions that I make in the actual work that's being made. So it's often part of the research, gets published either before, at the same time, or after the work is being presented. And I found that really helpful, because it also allows for making conversations with people that are, I think it allows for a truly interdisciplinary conversation with people that are outside of your comfort zone of talking about visual arts, for example, or if you do new media art, or whatever it is that is your expertise or your comfort zone. And I've always appreciated and really admired artists who do that and use the medium of writing, not just to share research, but to provide another way of thinking about the subject that you're tackling in your practice. And those have been artists, thinkers that I've got most of my inspirations from. We have to go into the 145th slide, and I'm not kidding. I had prepared that in case there will be time, but I think I timed it so that I will end in this last project. So the next project is in a nutshell, it's going to be another film slash intervention. So I've been looking at embassies and this idea of, the space of an embassy providing temporary kind of shelter for people in various situations of precarity, for example, fleeing political persecution, or asylum seekers. And I've been looking at historical instances of that in relation to the abandoned Iranian embassy in DC. These are all slides that are not relevant. So the film is about, I don't really know what form it's going to take, but I'm looking at the legal, architectural, and cinematic, probably these are the three ways that I'm approaching this. Ways of thinking about this abandoned embassy because of the lack of diplomatic ties between US and Iran. And this embassy that's been abandoned for 40 years now in DC, and ways of thinking about engaging with the building and going through the legal loopholes of having to deal with the US State Department and the government of Iran, possibly, to be able to either gain access or engage with the building. Because of sanctions, it's very difficult to upkeep the building because legally you're not allowed to spend money on the property of a government under embargo. So that's why the building has been kept in the state of ruin, or like barely alive, for the past 40 years. And I want to do some sort of, and these are the old photos of the building, but I want to do some sort of intervention or engagement with this building in a way that if it's not spending money on it, I've been thinking about this act of removal, or maybe like a removal of garbage, or like replicating part of the building in some way and like displacing it elsewhere. But also there's like reenacting where something is happening inside the building, and like those are the kind of like the filmic approaches that I would have to this project. But yeah, that's where my head has been for the past few months.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you.
Thank you.